So I decided to focus on adaptation to both climate variability and climate extremes. Extremes are being a component of climate variability under changes under future climates. The work that I'm going to show is part of CCAP and also but it's part of CCAP being conducted by CIAT, but also some work that we've been doing at the University of Leeds. So climate variability is, so we know there exists climate variability. Climate variability also has an impact on yield. Whether or not we can detect that signal is a slightly different question. Recently, this year, a global analysis was published where they wanted to look at how climate variability has an impact on yields and to what extent. So the main finding is about 1/3 of global yield variability responds to climate. This is only productivity. There's a component of area which has not been assessed so far, but as to the component of yield, it's about 1/3 of the variability that responds to climate. We can see, for example, it doesn't work very well, but we can see here, for example, many areas, for instance, for maize, actually respond to complex interactions between precipitation and temperature, and both means and their extremes. Some areas do respond to more to a normal extreme precipitation or extreme precipitation in the kind of bluish areas we see there, and some other areas respond a little bit more to temperature, both means and extremes. Okay. Much of this variability is linked to global modes of variability, such as ENSO. So another recent analysis published last year showed both for positive and negative ENSO phases what are the likely differences in crop yields for these major crops. Still, the fact that most of the studies focus, at least the global studies focus on these major crops, highlights important knowledge gaps in terms of the rest of crops, at least in terms of how many commodities we know that are widely consumed and reported to FAO. There's about 52 crop commodities which are reported to FAO. This is only 4. Still, these are the major 4, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of detection of climate signals on crop yields. You can see again, for instance, for maize, a lot of areas have negative yield impacts, particularly in the northern hemisphere, and in tropical areas, significant negative impacts or insignificant negative impacts. And in the southern hemisphere, you see, particularly in South America, you see a lot of areas with positive yields. This is linked to climate variability. Unfortunately, if you look at extremes, so far, there's very little that's being done in terms of spatially resolved impacts of extremes on crop yields for major crops, let alone the other rest of crops. But in the IPCC report in 2014 gave some idea of the linkages between different climate-driven yield production decreases and food prices. You can see there are quite notable examples. For example, here, the Russian wheat failure, and then also the drought that occurred here in the US. So all these climate extremes, reductions in productivity and reductions in global production have an impact on the global price index. So why do we care about extremes in the present state? Not only because we see there's linkages between variability and crop productivity and crop production, but also because in the future changes in climate can also lead to changes in extremes. So changes in climate, either if there's a shift in the mean, if there's a shift in variability, or if there's a change in the shape of the distribution of a climate variable, they will have an impact on extremes. Some of the work that Joshua did for the Global Food Security report shows some of these for for crop yields. Unfortunately, that's as far as it gets. It's very preliminary work. Still very interesting. There's a lot of potential, but there's not a lot that's being done in the literature. For climate, it's another story. So the global climate models are run on the global scale, and there's many analyses that show how extremes change. So people have been looking at agriculturally relevant measures during specific seasons. So for instance, here you can see in the left panel changes in warm spell duration, with the strongest changes across the tropics, and on the right you see for RCP 8.5, the changes in the dry spell duration, which is consecutive dry days. And you see again, you see a mixture pattern which is typical from projected precipitation changes by the CAGMIP models, and the stippling that you see there is areas where where the mean changes are not significant, either because uncertainty is large or either because the signal is not strong enough. So as I was saying, there's a significant knowledge gap in terms of trying to predict climate variability that impacts on crop yield variability. So this is well reflected in the latest assessment by the IPCC. You see only 3 crops have been assessed, one of which has been assessed only in one study, and wheat and maize have only been looked at in terms of changes in crop yield variability by 2 studies. Importantly, you can see that there's a trend, at least quite clear for rice, although it comes from a single study, that crop yield variability is projected to increase. As to whether this is robust across many areas in the globe remains to be seen, but this highlights an important knowledge gap, and definitely something where both local and regional scale studies and global studies have a role to play. So when you talk about extremes, there's some complexity. There is extremes can happen at a range of both temporal scales and spatial scales. As I was saying, there's global food shocks. There's also local impact extremes. And across temporal scales, you have sub-daily, daily, sub-seasonal, seasonal, and yearly, which are the most important extremes that at least can be captured in models. So here you see one of the AgMIP studies looking at the effect of extreme temperatures on grain yield, with 100% decrease in a range of about 15, 16 degrees increase in temperature. That's for wheat. Similar studies have been published for wheat in Europe. In that study particularly, they were looking at the co-occurrence of extremes in a single season. At the global scale, this is part of the GFS report. This is maize yields in a historical period, and you can see that the blue line, which is the simulated, which is the observed, is quite similar to the simulated, which is the brownish orangey line there. And models are able to capture some of the, or most of the yield failures, if you want. This is global average yields. In the future, projections, so as I was saying, across spatial scales, then there is work to be done. Extremes can be looked at in terms of multiple breadbasket failure or single bread basket failure and their impacts on the food system in terms of prices and food availability, but also locally. So here, for instance, you see changes in local mean temperature and their impacts in crop failure rates. What you see here in the green line is the historical crop failure rate, and you can see that for different, that particularly after above 2 degrees local warming, crop failure rates triple or more. So this means that, that adaptation is important, and the most
for the most part, the framework that people use to look at adaptation is across timescales, looks a little bit like this. So there's scoping strategies which involve agronomic management and varietal substitutions, these kinds of things. These help dealing with variability under the current climate. There are systemic changes such as which include shifts in livelihood or breeding of new cultivars, or for instance implementing site-specific or precision agriculture, these sorts of things. And when systems become unsuitable or too risky, then transformation is likely to happen. Transformations in the context of extremes, if you have very frequent extremes which are difficult to adapt to, for instance in a rice system, then it is likely you need to shift to a different system if systemic changes can't cope with it. I want to show an example of how local adaptation can help dealing with variability. CIAT has a project funded by the Ministry of Agriculture where basically they're trying to identify per environment the most appropriate planting date and the most appropriate variety to plant. This work uses historical information and field experiments to calibrate both seasonal forecasts and crop models, and then use them together to predict for the next season. It's done in all growing regions in Colombia. This is central, in the central area of Colombia, and this is in the north. What you see is when you get a robust weather forecast for the next season, then you're able to get, which you see here for precipitation, then you're able to get quite a robust forecast with low variation across simulations for the crop. This is crop yield here in the y-axis, and this is the sowing window. What this work highlighted is that if planting occurs at the beginning of the planting window, then there's not a lot of difference between different cultivars. But if planting is to occur after a given time, about after half of the planting window, then there's one particular variety that would do much better. So field experiments were conducted as well to test this sort of result, and they confirmed what the forecast was saying, basically. I think I'll end there.
All right, thanks.